Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third installment of these online conversations where we have been and will continue tonight to talk about racism and other important subjects that we are facing as Christians and as a nation. We're glad that you're taking time to be with us tonight. We call these Pull Up a Chair conversations in an effort to encourage people to live out the way of Jesus by sitting down with others face to face, where they can talk to each other, they can listen to each other, they can process things together, and especially sitting down with others with whom we disagree. And in those settings, having real conversations, having authentic conversations, and hopefully redemptive conversations about things like racism. A few nights ago, many of us watched what was advertised as the first presidential debate, but within 5 minutes, it turned into a national embarrassment and a prime example, I think, of how two people who disagree ought not do it. And so we certainly want to do a better job than that tonight. And tonight, what we really want to do is we want to invite Jesus to shape the tone of this conversation and teach us through our two panelists that you'll meet in a moment, Sharon and Jim. Our hope is to learn together tonight and grow together tonight. So again, we're glad that you have joined us. And I want to invite you, wherever you are, if you would pause and bow your head for a moment. I'd like to begin with a word of prayer. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we are thankful for the opportunity to step toward the difficult issues of our time and to do so with gentleness, to do so with grace, to do so with hope, and to do so with a desire and a hunger for your presence and for your truth. And so we come together here tonight in this forum. We thank you for the opportunity to gather, to speak freely, to listen to each other. And we pray that the power of your presence would be with us, that you would be our teacher, and that through Jim and Sharon tonight, that we would learn and we would grow together. So we commit our time tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, Sharon and Jim, as you'll find out, come from different perspectives on many issues. They have a different take on many issues. They see and feel the world differently at various points. They have different pasts and they have different career paths. But the one thing they have in common is the most important thing, and that is they are both Christ followers. So tonight is not a debate. Tonight is not a contest to see who wins or who loses. I'm hopeful that from where you are, tonight is not an exercise in hoping that your representative up here wins. That's not what we're here for. That's not even close to what we're here for. Tonight is a learning conversation where we want to enter into this with humility and grace. Both Sharon and Jim are actively engaged in the life and in the ministry of our church, but until a few weeks ago, they didn't even know each other. But I knew each of them, and in talking to them, I knew they had different views on various things, and I thought this was an excellent forum for them to come together and for us to come together and process these things. So here's the format we're going to use tonight. I asked each of them about a week or so ago to come up with 5 or so questions they would like to ask each other in tonight's forum. So approximately 10 or 11 of the questions that you're going to hear me asking come straight from Sharon and from Jim. So Sharon came up with about 5. She wanted to ask Jim. Jim came up with about 5. He wanted to ask Sharon. I'm going to facilitate the process and I'm going to ask the questions. And in addition, I came up with a few questions of my own that I'm hoping each of them will answer. These questions were given, the questions they came up with, they gave to each other ahead of time. We actually met the other day and processed some of these questions and made sure that we understood where each was coming from. But our desire here tonight is for these predetermined questions to become kind of a starting point for a more organic conversation about racism and about other related issues. In other words, that as these questions get asked, I've invited both Sharon and Jim to then follow up with other questions off script, unknown, and see if we can't generate more of an organic conversation about these important issues. So we may or may not get through all of the questions that they came up with. So I know that Sharon has been with us. Sharon Richards has been in this forum. This is the third time we've done it. It's the third time she's been here, so many of you know her. But it'd be good for you to hear a little bit about who both Jim and Sharon are. So Jim, let's start with you and tell a little bit about yourself, who you are, a little bit about your family and your career and how long you've been part of Oak Hills.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for this opportunity. I spent 29 years with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, where I retired as a captain. And during that time, I did just about everything in every service area, from patrol to corrections to investigations, support services, the 911 communications center. And it was a great career. I would not change anything about it. I loved going to work every day. And with the exception of a couple days, there were some tragedies, obviously. And then when my time was done there, I went up and I spent 3 years as the police chief in Placerville, where I served from 2017 until May of this year. And so that capped about a 33-year career. I'm not sure what God has in store for me next, but I enjoyed every minute of it, and I enjoyed serving the citizens that I did serve in those various communities. Obviously, most of my experience was in Sacramento, where I learned a lot about people. I worked every type of community you can imagine. I worked the area where our governor currently lives, and I worked some areas that were very challenged economically and otherwise, and everything in between. And I worked with some of the best people that I could work with in my profession. My family and I have been going here. My wife, Susan, and I have been married about 15 years. We moved to Folsom in 2007, and I think we started coming here regularly in 08 or 09, somewhere in there.
Okay.
And we have our daughter, Christina, who's a freshman at Folsom High School, and our son, Andrew, who's 10 and knows everything if you just ask. So,
okay. Thanks, Jim, for being part of this tonight. Sharon?
I lived up until a few years ago, lived in Folsom for about 26 years. My son went to Folsom High. My daughter went to Vista. I was on staff here at Oak Hills for about 14 years. And my current ministry that I've been doing and very passionate about is the racial reconciliation and just helping people get more comfortable with the uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah, good. So Sharon, let's start with you. I mentioned this earlier, but you guys didn't know each other a couple of weeks ago. And my mind had kind of been turning as I had had a couple meetings with you, Jim, and obviously known you for a long time, Sharon. And this idea of this would be maybe a fun thing to do tonight, or a valuable thing to do to have this conversation. So you guys didn't know each other, but I know a couple weeks ago you got together for the first time. Talk about what that first meeting was like.
Well, first of all, I have to say that Jim and his family usually come to the 9 o'clock. And I usually sit about 2 rows behind them at the 9 o'clock. And so when we have the blessing of our children, their kids are the ones that I usually extend my hand to. So it's pretty neat to just see him as a real person rather than just kind of exchanging pleasantries. When Jim and I met, it was just really, really fun and interesting. I walked away with such an incredible respect for him. And I just felt like, I said to him, I wish the camera had been rolling during that conversation, because we covered so much and I learned so much about police procedures and policies. He was incredibly gracious to me when I was like, but why this? Why not that? How come this? And he was just great, and things made sense to me.
Good, cool. Jim?
Yeah, I agree with Sharon. You know, we've known each other in passing in the church over the years, but I think we were together like 2.5 hours, and it wasn't labored, it wasn't difficult, and we actually just thoroughly enjoyed the discussion with each other. And I learned a lot about Sharon's story, and more importantly, how she sees the world and how she views Folsom and law enforcement in general. And so it was a good kind of a Q&A about what are your experiences and what do you think of this?
Yeah.
And it was good. I enjoyed that.
Good. So Jim, let's stay with you on this. I mean, this is kind of a difficult environment, right? I mean, we're in here, we're talking about a very difficult subject. It's certainly a hot topic in our world right now. We're in front of who knows how many people, and they're tuning into every word and every movement. And, you know, I've gotten things from people after these, you know, you touched your face too many times. So it's just scrutiny times 100, right? So here we are sitting here having this conversation. I'm curious, we'll start with you, Jim, in terms of apprehensions about this. Anything that, you know, you're just feeling as we enter into this?
So I'm not as apprehensive as I was when you first came up with this idea. You and I met shortly after the incident in Minneapolis.
Yes, right.
The George Floyd incident. And you just originally wanted to hear, what's my take? What do I think? And it evolved into, well, what if we make this into one of these pull up a chair discussions? And my comfort level immediately went away because I'm like, what do you mean you want me to sit in front of people and talk about this? And it's been a process for me because it's definitely out of my comfort zone to talk about race. The context in which I'm used to talking about it is at work. We're looking for this ex-male, this person, or answering a potential complaint when I was with both of the departments that I worked for. Never really in procedures or how people process or how the police view it.
Right.
But again, I am much more comfortable today than I was 3 or 4 months ago when you and I first touched on this.
Yeah, good.
So
good. Sharon, any apprehensions as we begin this?
I think the concern I had and, you know, have is that, you know, there's a lot of people who are just angry. And sometimes when you're angry, you really don't position yourself to listen.
Uh-huh.
And so I am hoping that people will hear my heart and Jim's heart and recognize that we are trying to understand each other on these things.
Good. So let's dive in. Jim, we'll start with you. The reason that this whole pull up a chair forum started really began in the aftermath of the George Floyd situation. And we talked about it a number of times in church services and then talked about racism. And the desire was, how do we continue to take additional steps as a church? So the first question, this is one of Sharon's for you, is as a police officer, as someone who's spent your career in law enforcement, what's your take on the George Floyd situation?
So on its surface, of course, I was as shocked as anyone. And I should back up and say, I'm not going to purport to speak for every police officer that may see my comments, but the way I saw it from the beginning, I couldn't understand why an officer would need to leave his knee on the neck of an individual for, I think it was 8 or 9 minutes, especially considering that he was already handcuffed and what we would consider in control. And then for him to have, the thing that caught me and a lot that I've talked to, is he had his hands in his pocket while he was doing that. And that just, it didn't look right.
The police officer?
The police officer had his hands in his pocket with his knee on the neck of George Floyd. And I didn't understand that because I've been in obviously a lot of these situations. I've supervised and reviewed a lot of these situations, and that didn't look right. Obviously then when he died, that looks bad. And, you know, the officer is going to pay the consequences for that. It didn't look right. I don't know one officer that thinks that was justified use of force. And I'm basing it on the law and procedures. I just didn't see a need to put his knee, or I should say leave his knee on his neck. If it was a dynamic fight that was still going on, that's different, but it wasn't. Obviously, we've all seen the videotape. And then there's background with that officer that, as an administrator, it concerned me. That I think I shared with you, he had, if you want me to discuss that.
I think that's important.
That he had 17 use of force complaints and none of them were substantiated.
Just for those of us who don't know this lingo,
Mm-hmm.
use of force complaint meaning what?
Meaning a citizen made a complaint against him for it, and I haven't read into this, but it sounds like excessive force. Okay. Like he used too much force to arrest me or my son or my mother or whatever. And those go to a review of what's traditionally called a professional standards or an internal affairs complaint. And all of those complaints for that officer came back as unsubstantiated. So in California, most agencies in this area, there's a variety of software programs that trigger when an officer has like maybe 4 complaints in a 6-month period or a 4-month period. The leadership would look at that and go, why is he getting all these complaints? And maybe we need to look further into training or his how he's handling calls for service, or she's handling calls for service. 17 was a lot of complaints for him to.
So that right there in your mind as a law enforcement is there's something there
that's a red flag. Yeah. That's a huge red flag. And it would be all the chiefs in this area, I think, would agree that would cause us to take note.
Okay. So regarding the racial part of this, the extent that you're comfortable with this, because this clearly set off a lot of reaction around racial issues.
The whole summer.
Yeah. All summer, yeah.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
I think you and I talked about it. What do I think was on that officer's in his mind? I'm not going to try to guess because I'm not him.
Sure.
But there's obviously a frustration in that community that they're potentially persons of color are not treated equitably. And that kind of translated, unfortunately, across the United States, which was just very unfortunate to watch, that an incident in Minneapolis triggered riots everywhere from New York to Los Angeles and everything in between. And that's just unfortunate because I understand there may be some frustration, but I think that's a poor way of going about it, burning out a city. Or I know in Los Angeles, I think they showed videotape of 25 police cars burned in one street. And then the number of people that were injured, including citizens and shop owners and business owners, as well as officers.
Yeah.
It's just an unfortunate situation.
Okay. Sharon, your turn. One of the things Jim asked, and I've heard other people talk about this, is when we think about the racial issue, and you think about some of the larger cities in our country, the city Jim cited was Baltimore City, Maryland, and the number of African Americans in influential positions of leadership in those city governments. So if you think about that, whether it be the police department, city council, mayor, whatever it is, how would you address the question, why is Baltimore and cities like Baltimore, where there may be a large number of African Americans in leadership, why is a place like Baltimore in the condition it is in after decades of African American leadership?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I'm not really sure that the fact that the mayor or the police commissioner is Black is directly related to whether or not things would get incredibly better. I mean, it's not magical. They still have to navigate policies, procedures, standards, all of those kinds of things. So I don't think we do that with other cities. I mean, why? So that's, I'm not completely comfortable with why do I have to try and justify why this particular city isn't doing better. That being said, because I did have the questions ahead,
Yes.
I did see that effective today, as a matter of fact, there have been some new things going on in Maryland. They had a couple of different things that got put into place. A Fair Housing Act went in, minority business that addresses economic racial disparity. Another thing that went in about hate symbols that were intended to ban those that are intended to threaten and intimidate people. Another one on maternal mortality. that addresses racial disparities in maternal health care. I say this to say that it's obvious that there are issues, and it's at least great that some of these things are being addressed. But just like in anything else, it takes time, and we don't know, I don't know, I'm not even in a position to know, how that city is run, how budgets are allocated. It's a bigger question than I can honestly answer.
Okay. So it may not reduce to who's in charge, may not be enough.
No, I don't think just because, it's not magic, right? So I don't think just because there are Black people in charge of some major positions that all of a sudden things are going to get beautiful. People are still living in poverty, or, this is where this whole issue of systemic racism and things like that come into play.
Yeah.
And those are things that, people have to actually believe exist.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's go on. Jim, oddly enough, last week, for a portion of the week, I was back in Wisconsin, and through a series of events, I ended up in Kenosha, and I ended up driving through on the street where many of the events with Jacob Blake happened, in Kenosha. And for those of you who may not know, he was the African-American gentleman who, through a sequence of events, we don't have time to go through all that, but ended up getting shot in the back by a police officer. So here's the question that Sharon has, and I think perhaps is on the mind of others. As a law enforcement person, Jim, can you think of a scenario where shooting a person in the back would be procedurally acceptable?
Yes. And I'm not going to say that Kenosha is one of those examples, but there are examples where that could happen. And I think we talked about them before. And the example I use, one is a suspect is running from a police officer. And at the same time, he's turning around. It's hard to do this on camera. And he's aiming his gun at the officers pursuing him. It's a very dangerous situation, but that's one incident where there may be, he may get shot in the back one or more times. Mm-hmm. And of course, everybody's going to ask why. Of course, the law will always look at what's called the totality of the circumstances, the overall situation. It's not just that the officer shot someone in the back. What was going on prior to that incident happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There are other incidents, I can think of some where an individual may be in a house and the officer said, I need you to stand up so I can search you for weapons. They're there legally on a call for service, mm-hmm. which is not unusual, or we usually ask, do you have any weapons in the house? And the guy suddenly reaches between his couch cushions. Maybe he's turned, and all of a sudden he comes up with a gun. And maybe there's an officer standing on his flank. That individual may get shot in the back because you can see the gun.
On something like that, let's say, because you said he reaches into the couch, he comes up with a gun. What if he reaches into the couch? What happens then? So you don't know what he's got, but he's reached into the couch.
Most officers are going to draw their weapons on him and say, you better come up slowly with your hands.
So draw their weapons, meaning?
Point their guns at
Point
them.
their gun at them,
Mm-hmm.
okay. And trying to get into the headspace of this, it's
a very stressful situation.
I would imagine, it's easy to sit back and analyze it. It's Monday morning quarterbacking in some ways. So, but the question I would ask is related to this is, so let's go to the Kenosha situation. Mm-hmm. And again, all the details, I don't know them all, but how many times, if there is a number, does a police officer say to somebody, you better get up slow, or get down on the ground, or stop moving? How does that work? Is there like, you do it 7 times and then it's all bets are off, or how do you do that?
There's no number that's going to be on that, Mike. It's going to be, each situation is going to be different. To be honest, I'd say 98% of citizens comply with a request like that. Or if we get up to a car in a car stop and somebody's fumbling around, you kind of go, hey, let me just talk to you before, because many people are trying to be helpful and get their registration and everything else. But through training and experience, you're going to learn if that guy's going into his glove box, he usually knows where stuff is, or is he reaching under his seat? That's not usually where you keep your registration. But there's no set number on how many times we're going to tell someone that.
Okay. I mean, when you watch some of these things, I guess for me, you know, on the one hand, you can see it and go, man, how do you shoot a guy that's 4 feet in front of you 5 times? And on the other hand, he can enter into the stress of it and go. So how do you help those of us who don't know what it's like to resolve that?
No, that's a good question. So because there's been a lot of those incidents over the course of my career where officers shot someone 6 or 7 times. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm going to try not to get into the weeds of the law, but the law says in summary, we can use whatever force is necessary to overcome that resistance to a deadly threat or a lawful arrest. And there's case law. Like I said, I'm not going to cite it because people will fall asleep. And the law reads, it's based on the mindset of the officer, and that is later judged, what we call the reasonableness standard. Reasonable officer under the similar circumstances in the same type of condition, what would that officer, that's what the courts look at. So there are some very clear questions that you have to resolve in your mind, and the officers many times have less than a second to make that decision.
Okay.
So,
I'm just spinning on this. You chime in if you want to, Sharon.
and I know that's hard for people to hear sometimes, that why someone was shot 6 times, or the other big one that might be on both your minds is, well, why didn't you shoot him in the leg? Why didn't you shoot him in the hand?
Yeah.
We're going to shoot to overcome that resistance. And if that person is holding a weapon, we're not all that great a shot where I can shoot you in the hand, but we're trained to immobilize that person. To stop that threat.
Okay.
I had a question, but I thought it was a good one, so I'll ask you again.
Okay.
You can see, sometimes you'll see that a couple, you want to be, what is it? Cop, police officer, what would you
Whatever
prefer?
you're comfortable with, Sharon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll hear a police officer, you get out of the car. Sometimes people put your hands out of the car. Sometimes don't get out of the car. How is that determined? Explain that to me.
Well, a lot of it's going to be determined is are you being pulled over just for a traffic violation, or are you being pulled over for, like we talked before we went on camera, well, this car matches a description of a purse snatch that took place at the factory outlets an hour ago. I'm going to be a little more careful here than a normal car stop. And there is no, I shouldn't even say, I catch myself, there is no normal or routine car stop. Typically, the more nervous the officer will be is if there's more people in the car. And it doesn't matter if they're old, young, doesn't matter what race they are. More people mean there's potentially more threats in the car. So there's no one standard way to go up on a car like that. What we usually tell citizens is just, if you're pulled over, just be still, and you can put your hands on the wheel, but don't make any sudden moves, and the officer will come up and ask for whatever they need to ask for. So
staying with this a little bit more in this, and obviously we talked about this before, that when we're just going here, there may be times where questions get asked that either one of them aren't comfortable answering. So that's a possibility on this one. But one of the real tension points that is currently in play in a lot of these conversations is, certainly the Minneapolis situation was one, potentially the Kenosha situation was one, but it's raised the issue of police officers and racism. And, just speaking from, it seems common sense, any profession, mine, yours, whomever's, there's good ones and bad ones, right? So in your experience, as this conversation about police officers and racism and so forth, I'm just going to leave it open-ended. How do you reflect on that from your experience?
Oh, that's a loaded question there, Mike. Again, this is one of the ones I don't think we really talked about
we didn't.
too much. My experience over the course of my career is the majority of police officers are not racist, in my view, okay? Now, have I seen some that are? Yes. They were terminated, all right, from when I was in the sheriff's department. Sometimes for racism, sometimes but they violated policies or they did stuff related to bad things. But before they get hired, especially today more than ever, there's a pretty vigorous screening process that goes on for candidates to become law enforcement officers, whether they're a CHP officer, deputy sheriff.
This is you're talking
in California, right? And I would like to think the rest of the nation, although I went to the FBI National Academy, which is a national training program for police executives, and I learned the United States, we follow all the case law from the courts, but each state is very different. But in California, we have a pretty rigorous screening process that every department has to follow. The number that's usually quoted is it takes 100 applicants to find one potential candidate before we find somebody that meets the standard that is acceptable for us. We have a very high standard for someone we're going to hire. We're talking about hiring someone that can take a human life or deprive you of your civil rights and take you to jail.
Right.
With all due respect, that's not somebody that's just applying to work at McDonald's or the outlets or Macy's.
Right.
So there's a whole screening process that goes into that. One of those things we try to weed out is somebody who has some racial biases, some very negative racial biases. And as much as they'll try to hide it, we without getting into the weeds again, we can figure that out.
Okay.
Some obviously make it through the system.
Right.
And when that happens, then that has to be addressed by the leadership of whatever police or sheriff's department that we're talking about.
Good. Thanks, Jim. Many of those were not on the paper. So
no, they weren't. And I'm just talking. So
good. So Sharon, let's turn to you. This was one of Jim's questions. This is a question that many people have. You've heard it, I'm sure, many times. We've talked about it every one of these forums so far, and it has to do with the Black Lives Matter movement. So the question is, what's your understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement's purpose? Or if you prefer, your thoughts on BLM?
So as I've said before, there's Black Lives Matter, and then there's the entity. And those I think what ends up happening is most people think Black Lives Matter, they get mad, and then they just figure, they throw out the entity, they throw out the meaning of Black Lives Matter, the whole thing. I think that Black Lives Matter is just trigger words for people. And what I would like to say is that many people will say, well, blue lives matter, red lives matter, all lives matter. And the Black Lives Matter moniker is not to say that other lives don't matter. Black Lives Matter is important. I'm not talking about the organization, just Black Lives Matter.
The phrase.
The phrase.
The idea.
The idea is because historically, Black lives have not mattered. And you don't need to do a whole lot of, much research at all to see that it has not proven out that Black lives matter, whether pick a system, any system. The hard part is that
pick a system, any system.
Meaning economic system, educational system, housing, pick any of those, and you'll see that there are disparities. And so I just recently listened to a podcast and they were talking about this, and I loved what they said. They said, Black Lives Matter, consider it as an affirmation that Black lives matter. It is not an accusation. You should not feel threatened if somebody says Black Lives Matter. And these other things about other different people's lives mattering is more a defensive posture instead of just meeting people where they're at, in their pain, in their history, and just going, you're right, Black Lives Matter. I did want to say one thing earlier about something that Jim said, that, some of these deaths recently have resulted in riots, but, that was not, I don't believe, some may take exception, that was not the intent. There are people who are just destructive, and I'm not happy with them either. But you can have people who are gathering peacefully,
Yeah.
even with signs,
Right.
and doing all the right things that we as citizens are allowed to do. And then you have ne'er-do-wells, and those unfortunately seem to get the press, and it just gets worse and
Yeah.
worse and worse. But please don't think that every rally or demonstration is going to result in a riot.
Yeah.
And we know that sometimes some of those people come from other cities
Right.
and other things. So I'm not making excuses, nor am I condoning any of that. It's horrible and destructive and contrary to any message that I would like white America to hear.
Yeah.
So it's
And
important to me.
unfortunately, those that are peaceful don't get the media.
That's correct.
Because I think there's been rallies here in Folsom.
Yep.
I think it was 3 or 4 weeks ago now, there were more riots in downtown Sacramento, but that was a different group than the group that peacefully demonstrated a couple hours before that. And if you talk to the city police department, they were two very different groups. And as Sharon said, a lot of that later group that went and did all a lot of them weren't from Sacramento at all.
So this is an important point. This came up the other day when we were talking about to your point, Sharon, the peaceful protests against racism, the systemic racism you mentioned, not only is allowed, it's a good thing. It raises awareness. It's one way to say we'd like to see change happen. And within that, you both talked about this the other day, within that, there has unfortunately been other groups that are turning it into destruction. And I saw this in Kenosha. I drove right by some of the burned out buildings and burned down businesses. And you don't have to even know what was there to look at it and go, that was somebody's livelihood. And so that's an important distinction, I think, what you're saying, that and, you know, back to the BLM question, there are people who want to attribute all of this to the Black Lives Matter movement. And in the course of that, if I'm hearing you, the really important thing that Black Lives Matter, here's why, as a phrase, as an idea, might get swept away in the negativity against the movement.
Absolutely. And I've said this, I know I'm beating this drum, horse, whatever, but we must be willing to do the research.
Yes.
Stop reading little blips and your banners and just do the research. And I think you'll find, because we know this, that a lot of times the news manipulates us.
Right.
The press manipulates us. So, you know, I just feel as a citizen that part of my job is to do that kind of work, to find out what is the truth behind that.
Yeah.
What really happened here.
Yeah.
And this is why my conversation with Jim was so valuable, because he did, you know, he did clarify some things for me.
That's it. You've said that every one of these. You got to do the work. You got to be willing to stretch and
go past the headlines.
Yes.
Yeah.
And people watching this, if any of you work in the news media, my apologies, but locally, there's a lot of disinformation and lies that get printed in a certain newspaper, and I'll leave it at that. Just aren't accurate.
I guess we're in it now.
It's okay.
That's good. You said it. I like it. I think the other thing related to this is push past the headlines. But it seems like also, and you were alluding to this, Sharon, push past the headlines, you're inclined to read and rely on. From the source you tend to turn to that you think is representing the truth. Got to go further than that on this stuff. Okay.
Right.
Good. So Jim, back to you. Again, we talked a little bit about this, but I think it would be helpful. Sharon asked this question. Can you tell us what kinds of training is provided for peace officers in terms of de-escalating high intensity situations?
So in the basic academy right now in California, I think is pushing upwards of 800 hours of required training before an officer even puts a badge on. A lot of it are mandates, but most of it are just best practices and trends that come up that the post, so California Peace Officer Standards and Training determines that we need to give the officers in the basic academy. From my research on the post website, they get 40 hours of training in, I'm gonna have to look at my note here. Let's see here. Because I don't want to get this wrong. Here we go. Crisis intervention training, it's 40 hours of basic academy training. And then for those that are already out of the academy, they're supposed to get 24 hours of what we call continued professional training. That's in addition to crisis intervention and de-escalation training, which is another 8 hours. And so the CIT training, the crisis intervention training, is how to de-escalate somebody that may be having a mental health crisis, how to maybe approach them so you don't startle them and trigger a bad response. So these are all, the way I was trained 30 years ago is to start from the lowest possible level of force and go from there. But now it's just more formalized and codified by the legislature. And some of this are what are called perishable skills. So everybody has to review these every 2 years, which is a good thing. And you know what, from what I've seen, officers, I've seen some officers and dispatchers, because this applies to dispatchers now, to try to calm people down before an officer gets there. And they just do a phenomenal job of things that could go really sideways, just their approach. And talking to these individuals who have serious mental health issues. And then, you know, a lot of times, as you can imagine, that's mixed with substance abuse, whether it's alcohol, drugs, legal or illegal, they're on a prescription. And we hope that works. I don't have the data as to how much better it is. I didn't look that far. From my observation, it is better. There are some people that it's just not going to work on. They're so far out. That some more force is going to be necessary to make that person comply.
Did you tell me in one of our coffees or lunches, in some respects, the first approach of a police officer in a situation is to try to de-escalate? Yes.
It's always, the terminology we use is start from the lowest possible level, as opposed to getting out of your car and going, hey man, what's your problem? You see in the movies. So we'll go back to the media, and the bad stereotypes of law enforcement officers are put forth by Hollywood. It sells movie tickets, I get it, or they show how things might have been done 40 or 50 years ago. And even then I would contest, I would question that, because my dad was a cop 50 years ago, and I used to hear him talk about how he treated people, which was the way we do today. But you always want to just try to start it at a level which starts also at a position of mutual respect, right? Now, I'm talking about a regular contact. I'm not talking about the person, Mike Lucan, you're a murder suspect and I'm looking for you. That's not going to start from a position of, that's going to start at gunpoint, and we're going to go from there. Okay, I want to make that clarified. So there is a difference.
Okay.
So hope that answered that.
It does. That's good. I'm flirting with a follow-up, so
that's okay.
Here's the follow-up.
If I can't answer it, I'll tell you.
Got it. It seems to me there have to be, while what you said, I get it, and it makes sense. There have to be cases because of, let me put it this way, because of human nature, right? Because of pride, arrogance, unchecked stuff that rumbles around in most of us, there have to be instances where putting a uniform on somebody exaggerates things like pride and arrogance and, here I am, and that has to happen.
I'll try to answer the way I think you're looking for, and jump in, Sharon. If you
Ego has to be inflamed by a uniform in some people.
It can be. So in the training academy, we try to instill into a young recruit to develop a sense of what we call command presence. But that has to be checked, that it doesn't go so far as to what you just said. that you walk into a room and you don't want to talk to anybody. I've seen those officers, and they're not officers anymore for a variety of reasons. It's the leadership of a department. Going back to the selection and training, and just as important as after the guy gets out of the academy or female, is watching them for their what we call their first or 1 or 2 probationary years, as we call them. Most departments evaluate them at least 2 or 3 times in those first few years. And that's going to be up to the sergeant to monitor their calls, maybe go with them on a call or 2 and see how they handle. The big thing that I have found is ask their peers how they're viewed.
Okay.
Hey, how's Jim Ortega doing on his calls?
Okay.
They're going to tell you the truth. The officer, if a sergeant shows up on their call, well, of course they're going to be Johnny A+. I'm going to act perfect. But you're going to get a better feedback from their peers.
Okay. So again, to cycle back to something we touched on earlier, how does a guy, if you go with that peer thing, how does a guy who has 17 abuse of force marks on his record, not only if they're asking his peers, is that not somehow coming up?
Yeah, again, so we're going back to Minneapolis. Just from other reviews that I've seen so over the course of my career, I've seen a lot of reviews of police departments. The one I can think of, and he won't mind that I mention it, is Rick Brazil, who's the retired police chief in Sacramento, was one of many who did a review of the Ferguson incident.
Okay.
And to listen to him break it down, I've listened to other presentations by him. He's a highly respected professional in this area. We dig into the training, the selection. How are things done? I'm trying to think of the terminology we like to use. Is what are tolerated behaviors that are just allowed to occur, and what is put in check? What are the sergeants and the line supervisors correcting at the line level? That's really where the rubber meets the road. Okay. So back to your question about a guy with 17 complaints, there's a disconnect there somewhere, in my opinion. I just can't fathom where that would be accepted behavior.
Because my recollection of that is not only is he sitting there with his knee on George Floyd's neck, I don't know what they called it, but he was somehow training these other, what do they call it?
There were 3 other officers there, and you can't really hear what they're saying, but I don't know what he was trying to demonstrate by having his knee on that guy's neck, on Mr. Floyd's neck. I can't get there.
What was so outrageous about that is 8 minutes and 46 seconds is a long time.
That is
a long time. And what was also so outrageous about it is that there were other officers there. There were people yelling. He's saying he can't breathe. People have their phones out. And so, I'm thinking, how does this fellow feel empowered to do this?
So that goes back into the conversation. I think, Sharon, I've had it with you. I know Mike and I, I may get some hate mail for this, but there will be, because I just know how this is going to go. There will be a top to bottom review of the Minneapolis Police Department and figure out what was the culture like in that police department. How are they trained? What is their training program, or what we call FTO program, look like? What are field training officer?
Got it.
How are the rookies trained when they first get into the department? What are they trained? Are they trained in areas like procedural justice and de-escalation? I mean, Minnesota's a different state, so I don't know.
Sure.
Then I would definitely not say that the whole state of Minnesota is like that, but it's going to be, it'll be an interesting review. And even though I'm retired from the business, I'm going to be one of the first ones, because I'm just curious about this kind of stuff.
So I asked you before, but I'll ask again. Do you feel, I know you can't speak for all police officers, but do you feel that having cameras in cars or body cams, do you feel better about that? Or does that make officers nervous? Now everybody's watching them. What do you think?
So you're talking about the body-worn cameras that the officers wear,
and
then there's also a car-mounted option.
Correct.
More departments are going away from that because the body-worns are so much more Like it sees what the officer sees.
Gotcha.
I think that is one of the greatest inventions and to ever come out for law enforcement. Because in my experience, when I was in Sacramento County, we started with the body-worn camera, or I'm sorry, the car cameras. And like you said, Sharon, everybody was nervous. I was a sergeant, I think, when those came out. But it became immediately clear that it was protecting everyone, including the officers, because I'm just going to say it, there are some complaints against the police. People lie to us. People distort the truth. The camera can give us some context as to what happened. It won't always answer every question, but it can add context. The body worns are even better, in my opinion. When I was the chief in Placerville, they had body worn cameras there, which were just phenomenal. Not a lot of complaints in Placerville, but the few we had, we were immediately able to look at that incident and see if there were any grounds for what was being said to us about an officer's performance or what they said. I dare say there's probably not at least a chief and the command staff around our state that would not like to have those. Now, it is a very expensive capital outlay, and that's been some of the challenges for some departments, especially the larger ones that I've got 600 officers in the field, and I've got to find a camera for every one of them, right? And it's not just the equipment, it's the storage. We want to archive those videos for usually 1 or 2 years. So
It's probably cheaper than a lawsuit, though.
and that's the argument that all of the risk management companies will tell us every time. And so, but it you know, that's something I don't want to get into. Various city councils and boards of supervisors, they have to make those decisions. So,
okay, Sharon, let's go to you.
Yes.
What this question has come up in one form or another all throughout the times we've done these. Jim has asked the question again. Do you believe race relations in the United States have improved over the last 40 years? Why or why not?
I knew this question, right? But it's still hard to answer because it just feels like it's a question that requires a couple hours discussion, but I'll try and answer it this way. I'm not satisfied with where we are today. To me, when people ask this question of, do you feel it's improved? I want to go, I would want to say to the person who's asking me, who is most likely white, or at least not a person of color, what would be an acceptable period of time that you feel that I should be okay with things? I was born in this country too. I'm an American. I expect that the laws are going to give me the same kind of protection as they would give Jim. That is not how it is. I will always get pushback from people because they don't believe it. But I think part of why they don't believe it is because they have no real personal context. So
Don't believe
that things are not better.
Oh, I got you.
Or is not as better as they may think it is.
Okay.
I think that a lot of the things, as we're seeing in the news, right? I mean, we saw it Tuesday night, you know, I don't think things are better. I think they have morphed into other things. We can use code words like nationalism. We can use all kinds of little words and little just words that will make you think that things are better. But I would suggest ask somebody who is living right now that you feel comfortable with asking, do they think that life is better for minorities? And I would say that many would say no. It's covert versus overt. It's all kinds of things like that.
So this is a difficult question. And again, part of our purposeful forum here is to press into it, maybe not always play nice with each other for the sake of, these are the real things that people grapple with in this. Because the question, just to come back to this, the question is, and I want to ask it maybe in a slightly different way. Do you think that there has been, however wavy the trend may be, have things improved over what, 40 years, 50 years, whatever, meaning this, and I've heard people say this, People said this to me after the last forum. Mike, you can't possibly tell me that Sharon or Allison don't think that things are inching forward and getting better. They're not where they need to be, but they're improving. Aren't they improving from 1962?
Why? My question then is, why is that the issue? They need to be improved. How quickly or how slowly they need to be improved? This is a hard question to answer right here, but it really is a matter of better to whom are you talking? To my mom and dad? To my in-laws? It's just different. It's just different.
Is part of your, when you say we need a couple hours, is it because your gut tells you there's something behind that question? That's not the real question.
I am still having conversations with people who want to argue about the existence of racism or systemic racism in this country. So when people still want to have that conversation with me, that tells me that they have blinders on. And some of that is because they might be guilt or shame or whatever, and they don't want to deal with the reality, or maybe it's because they are living in a life such that they don't have interaction with people of color, or people of color that they can really ask about that experience. So
okay.
Is it better than it was 40 years ago? I think it depends on who you're asking. Maybe to people looking who's not living it day to day, but this is my life.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, I don't think it's much better. I don't think it's much better. Now, I know what people will say, Mike. They'll say Allison and Sharon, well, they lived in Folsom and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. There was a lot that had to happen to make that happen.
Good.
And it's not all pretty. And there's damage done, and there's pain, and there was sacrifice for it. Whether mine, my husband's, my father, whoever.
So would you say that for those who are wondering about that, again, let's take people where they are. For those for whom that's the question, would it be helpful to say, so let's take a step beyond that, meaning step towards somebody who is a person of color, and instead of sitting in that question saying, well, they're not answering the question, or how can they not say that, or how can she say, step towards a person of color, you maybe, and say, let's spend that hour or two and unpack that.
Well, I mean, that's one way, recognizing that, like I said, there's a lot of pain in a lot of these stories, and you might not get an answer right away. I shared it on the last Pull Up a Chair.
Yeah.
There's a cost to me sharing part of my story, and whether or not I feel safe with everybody to even go there, to even feel like what I'm saying would be believed or validated. You need a relationship.
Good. That's good. So we didn't talk about this one, Jim, but I'm going with it. Okay.
I'm ready.
So you've said this a couple times. I want to ask you in a similar question I just did you ask Sharon? I want to ask you related to police officer training and awareness. So here's the question. Over the last 40 years or 50, whatever number you want, do you think police officer sensitivity and awareness of racial issues has increased and gotten better? Meaning 40, 50, 60 years ago, perhaps there wasn't as much invested in training of police officers regarding racial issues, but today there is.
Yes, I think that there is a better awareness of racial sensitivity, maybe not even just racial sensitivity of people from different worlds, including the LGBT community, how officers interact in those communities of color. there is just a lot more training that I didn't bring that in front of me. But in fact, 20 years ago, I was a trainer for some training that we did in the sheriff's office as a result of some findings. I am almost positive, and if my dad were here, I'd ask him, there was probably none of that training back in the day. So things have gotten better. I would also say that at least in California, again, I'm going to speak for California, most law enforcement agencies look very different than they did even 25 years ago. And in the way of a diverse, not just workforce, but the leadership of these departments. 30 years ago, it would have been unheard of, at least, I'm trying to think. Yeah, well, I don't know if we had any female police chiefs 30 years ago. Now they're all, it's great because they didn't come into the business. They really weren't even allowed to work in patrol positions until the 70s. And so then they started getting into leadership positions. Okay. So I think things are better, but there's always, you've heard me say this, there's always more we can do.
Yeah.
We don't get to a point in our profession and go, we're done.
Yeah.
We've arrived.
Got it.
I'm going to quote my good friend Sheriff Scott Jones. There's no best practices, only better practices.
Got it. Good. So let's stay with you, Jim, on this. Another question Sharon raised, it's a big one right now, related to defunding the police, or eliminating police presence in some areas. So what are your thoughts on this?
So, and I've shared this with both of you, just start with removing the police presence from certain areas. So like I said earlier, I worked all different types of areas in Sacramento County, from the very wealthy areas to the areas that are not so wealthy and everything in between. And I've probably attended and even conducted hundreds of community meetings with people from various communities. And I've had thousands of questions, and never did I hear a citizen say, we'd like to see less patrol cars in our area. I hear just the opposite from areas that are really challenged or having crime problems. What can you, the police, do about X, Y, Z problem? And so we engage and try to find some problem solving. And you know what? We have had a lot of successes. One thing that, I don't know, has been mentioned in any of our conversations, so I'm going to throw this to you.
Okay. And
maybe Sharon, is the trajectory of violent crime in the United States and California and even in our area since the middle 90s has trended down, substantially down. But if you ask the average person, they would go, oh my gosh, things are out of control. There's more violent crime than there ever has been. That's not true. I think I shared the homicide rates for some of our cities in our area are more than cut in half from the middle 90s. So, and that wasn't by accident. There were some direct, operations that were done there. But to defund the police or remove the police out of the area, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the police are the solution for all community problems. In fact, a good law enforcement agency, a good sheriff's department will realize that they need to collaborate and work with outside entities to work on issues in their communities. It's been my experience that all that crime reduction, that wasn't just law enforcement. That was a lot of community efforts by a lot of different entities just in Sacramento.
Good. So. Good. Okay, we'll keep rolling. And so Sharon, this is from Jim to you, sticking with the police. Do you believe there is ever a need for the police to use deadly force?
So, I mean, that's a tough question. I would defer after having my conversation with Jim. I don't know how to answer that, but I think that I would defer to Jim on that. But I know this, there are, like Jim said, there's good cops, and the majority of them police officers, and the majority of them are good police officers. So at the end of the day, citizens and police officers want to go home, So I would like to trust that police officers are going to use the appropriate procedures on situations.
Yeah. And maybe to stay with this a little bit, and Jim, to get your thought on this, there's this other strand of thought flying around that citizens can organize into, I don't know if they call them law enforcement, but groups that in effect police
Militia.
their own areas and things like this. What do you think of that?
You know, one thing that we say in policing, all policing is local, so every community is different. Because I just saw a story last week where I think his name is Gordon Sliwa. He was the leader of the Guardian Angels for New York City in the 70s, is back in action because
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, in New York City, because New York City is going through an unfortunate escalation of crime. I'll leave it at that. For years, New York City was the safest large city in the United States for like 20 years. They went from having, I remember the number, 3,500 homicides in 1990 to trending between 350 to 400 homicides. Now, for a city of 8 million people, that's still 400, obviously too many murders, but that's an amazing number, and that's an amazing reduction in violent crime. But for people to just start taking, in general, to start policing their in the manner they think is necessary in their own city or county, yeah, most of us are going to have some concerns about that. And that discussion, rather than having a force like that, that should be maybe a conversation that group should have with their police chief or their sheriff.
Yeah.
Rather than starting to take things in their own. And maybe things have collapsed to the point where there is no law enforcement.
Yeah.
Thankfully, in California, we're not there yet. There's some cities that are challenged, but I don't think we're at that point.
So I want to ask both of you this next one. So this is off script a little bit, but Sharon, I'm going to ask you first, Jim, but I'm going to ask you the same thing related to the relationship between people of color and police officers. So from your perspective, Jim, as a law enforcement person, how can trust be established between people of color and police officers?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And I saw that question, and I've had a couple days to think about it, but there's no easy answer, first of all, because as Sharon has said, the officer isn't going to know the journey that person has had. So I think the first thing is to be open to hear their journey, whether it's been one of growing up in a relatively safe area where there's not a lot of crime, or maybe this individual, I'll just say for conversation's sake, a male who grew up in an area that was gang-ridden and very poverty-stricken. But just to reach out to each other and have maybe a conversation, before all this COVID business, one of the greatest things, I think most officers, I don't know who came up with it, were these coffee with a cop things that the law enforcement officers will show up at a coffee shop. And I know in Folsom, they try to spread them out, and they advertise it. Hey, we're going to be there between 8 and 10 a.m. on this day. Come by and have a cup of coffee. Talk about anything you want. And I know I've done those in Placerville, and there was really no subject off the table. People could come and talk to us. Now, I know that for a fact they have those coffees with the cop in the challenge areas in Sacramento City and County as well. That's just one way people can maybe go up and have these discussions in a, how do I put this, in a no TV cameras over here.
Yeah,
It's
right.
one-on-one like this, or three of us having a discussion, and ask those officers, and there's usually going to be somebody of rank there, a sergeant or above, that you can ask the questions like Sharon and I spent 2.5 hours. Why is this policy? Why that? Yeah. That's a beginning way. I think another way, to be quite honest, is to try to get the young kids to trust law enforcement in the schools, not the high school. By the high school, they've already got a lot of preconceived notions. Grammar and middle school. The officers are approachable. We're their friend. We're somebody you can trust. One of the things that irritated me my whole career was if I'm in a restaurant or if I'm out in public, a parent would go, if you do anything wrong, he's going to take you to jail. there is so much damage done to that young kid. And I don't care what race or gender that child is. Now he fears us.
Yeah.
And so a lot of us have come up with clever ways to gently tell the parents, hey, please don't say that. So those of you watching, please don't do that when you see our good, fulsome officers in our community, because that child is going to remember that. What we want them to remember, and what I used to do, is I would kneel down and go, not only am I not going to arrest you, if you're ever in trouble, I want you to come up to me and tell me you need help, because I'm going to help you, or anybody that is in a law enforcement uniform. So those are just a couple ways. I mean,
that's helpful. So Sharon, try to help this idea of a person of color, maybe in a situation where it's not fulsome. It's a situation that is a more difficult urban setting, for example. I don't know if you can do this, but what are your thoughts about people of color and the police and building more relationship and trust?
Well, certainly when I was a kid, I mean, the firefighters and police officers used to come to our school and tell us, give us a little comic book and tell us stories and all that stuff, and we trusted them. But now I think that's gone. I think that there's just too many stories, too many stories of what can happen. I mean, I've shared before, I'm even with my kids here in Folsom, growing up in Folsom, just kind of meeting as a parent, feeling with Black children to have to explain to them, this is what you need to do. It's not about the cops can't be trusted. I just want you to be safe, because there are, I just want you to be safe. So, follow the directions, do what they ask, all those kinds of things. This is a conversation that happens in many homes of people of color, because there is a distrust of the police. And, incidences have played out such that, nationally perhaps, that you can't always trust the cops.
So you've mentioned this before. You had this discussion.
Yes, I did.
When your children were younger.
When they
were driving or whatever.
When they started driving.
When they started driving.
Yes.
I did not have this discussion with Sam, with Abigail, or with Isabel. So, I mean, jump in here. This is an important piece of the puzzle in my mind, because you had the discussion. I mean, let's just say it, because there was, for whatever reason, there was the sense of mistrust. What?
Some of the things that we're talking about, whether it's bad cops, whether it's use of excessive force, whether it's profiling, whatever it is, and maybe that is a small percentage of the peace officers that are around, but at the end of the day, I still want my kid to come home.
Yeah.
So I'm going to teach them, and we're going to have a conversation on what you need to do, so that there's no mistaking, there's no mistaking on anybody's part. I don't want this thing to go sideways.
I think this is so important. I mean, I've known you a long time. You and Terry and your family lived in Folsom. I mean, Sam and Jordan, played with each other when they were little kids. And this is an important piece of this, if for no other reason to understand, for all of us to understand. I never had those discussions with my children. You raised your kids here in Folsom. I raised my kids here in Folsom. Folsom is a marvelous city. I'd walk down the street of Folsom at any hour of any day. you had that discussion, I didn't. If nothing else, and this is, we're freelancing here, but if nothing else, that tells me I can only do one of two. There's one of two things I can do with that coming from you. And this has a larger implication. I hope it's obvious. On the one hand, I can go, well, Sharon, you know, she's exaggerating, or she's whatever, or, you know, I can write it off, in other words. Or I can be stunned by such differences, even though we're in the same town. And I can pause and go, I need to learn something here. I need to recognize your experience here, based on whatever, doesn't matter, turned into a conversation with your children, a pretty significant one, that I didn't have to have. And because I know you, I can't just say, oh, well, shoot that aside. I have to go, or I feel like I have to say, what is there for me to learn here? There's something in this issue that we, I hope, continue to press toward, because this matters as Christ followers, this matters as citizens, and you have a perspective and you have knowledge I need to hear about and learn from and be shaped by.
Can I throw a curveball at you?
Please.
Because you've thrown a couple at me, so now it's my turn.
Go.
So you and I are about the same age. We won't go into what that age is. But back when I was learning how to drive, living here in Sacramento County, I lived in Carmichael at the time. But my father, my parents were divorced, so he still lived in San Jose. We had that conversation. And but for I think different reasons. His reason was, based on what he had seen, hey, if you get pulled over, just stay in the car, don't get out. And some other language of my dad's, don't get smart with the officer, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And do what he tells you. And I don't think I quite understood, but later on I figured out, well, my dad has seen a lot of other stuff, and because people didn't follow directions, I don't think there were no tragic outcomes with my dad, but he had seen some incidents. So, and I'm going to have those same discussions with my kids when they learn how to drive.
So let me ask you about that. Are you done throwing your curveball?
I suppose so, unless you're going to do something. You're going to throw me.
I don't want to cut you off, but
Okay.
But isn't that because your dad was in law enforcement and you were in law enforcement, so you have an insider view
It
of
could
this?
be versus race. Absolutely.
Yes.
So there's two different reasons,
Right.
for sure.
Right. But I mean, again, if I wasn't talking with Sharon, if you and I were talking and you said, well, I've had that conversation with my children, my first response would be, well, Jim, you have a perspective on things that I don't have. So it may not be a racial thing.
You're right. And I offered to send you on a ride along if you would like to experience that. You turned me down.
I didn't turn you down. I delayed the appointment.
Gotcha.
But again, back to what Sharon's saying, Sharon's was a race thing.
Absolutely.
Where I grew up, again, back in the area where Kenosha was just a little bit north of there, the area I grew up was way more racially diverse than Folsom. And both in terms of, I mean, it just way different, especially when I was growing up there. I never had this discussion with my parents. My parents never told me this kind of thing. And I think that's significant as it relates, to me it is. Now, I want to give you a chance to respond to what Sharon said. What do you make of that?
So her having the conversation with her children about getting pulled over, I think it's sad. And this is not a critique of you, Sharon, at all. I know you and I've kind of touched on this, that there is still in 2020, this distrust of law enforcement officers. I'll just say in California, and particularly in the Sacramento area where I've worked, and I've spent a lot of time to hopefully build that trust with these communities. I think I speak for everyone. The one time I'll say that is that means there's more work to do to build that trust, to gain that trust from communities of color that nothing is going to go wrong if now your grown children are driving along and they get pulled over, all things being equal, if they just had a burned out taillight or they were speeding, that it should come out fine. And it is unfortunate that you and Terry still don't feel that way. So that we have work to do. And I think everybody would agree with that, which is what a lot of without getting into the weeds, there's a lot of initiatives going on at the state level and the local level to address some of this. Can I mention one thing?
Sure.
that just locally, I talked to one of the lieutenants here in Folsom. So there's a thing called the Citizens Academy, which right now they're not doing it because of the COVID. But what it is most departments have some form where it's like 1 or 2 hours once a week for like 10 weeks, where citizens basically get an insider's view of their police department. How all the questions you've asked, Sharon, how are people trained, selected, recruited? What's the ongoing training? You get a real feel for how things go. More importantly, the overall culture of the police department. What are they like? And it's usually an eye-opener for just everyone I've ever talked to that's done it. They had no idea that some of this stuff is trained. So when COVID is over, I'm sure Folsom will push out another option for Citizens Academy. Anybody watching, if they're really interested, that's a good way to get to know your department. There's a lot of things I think Folsom PD does in a good way.
Yeah.
We have an excellent police chief. Rick did not pay me to say that, but Chief Hillman is a great police chief. He just did a presentation about a month ago at the city council where he addressed a lot of these issues. You can go back and watch it if you're bored. But he outlines a lot of stuff that we've discussed here tonight.
That's good. That's helpful.
So,
okay, Sharon, one more, and then we'll start wrapping up. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I certainly heard this asked, and this isn't exactly a question that Jim posed, but it's trying to pull together different bits of our conversation the other day. And this is influenced by conversations I've had with other people, and has to do with statistics. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but in the conversation about racism, in the conversation about shootings, in a whole myriad of conversations around this subject, there are numbers, statistics tossed around, all coming from every direction about, well, really the percentage is only this, the percentage is only that. I'm not suggesting at all that there aren't somewhere in the universe actual hard data where percentages that actually reflect reality exist. But in this conversation, my question is, when you hear that kind of conversation around statistics as a person of color, what do you do with all that? How does that land on you? Or how do statistics factor into either your perspective, or maybe the better question is, how should statistics in your mind factor into people's perspective on these things?
Well, I mean, when we just start throwing numbers out like that, Mike, I just don't think on those terms. For me, those numbers are people. Those are lives. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Bolton, what's his name? Botham Jean, Sandra Bland. I mean, these are real people. These are real people. So this is, I can't get into, well, 72% or 14% or whatever. These are people with real bodies that bore the image of God. So I just am not a fan of, well, that's not so bad. Well, right. No, these are people, they had moms, dads. I mean, Sharon, can't separate that out.
Yeah.
I'm not okay with, well, that percentage is okay. Only 200,000 people have died from COVID. Well, that's 200,000 people who have died. I mean, I can't that's not how I'm wired.
Yeah.
So
got it.
Yeah, I just can't just do stats. These are real people. Trayvon Martin was a real person. Eric Garner was a real person. Tamar Rice was a real person.
Good. Okay. This one's for both of you. We'll start with you, Jim. In this process, so this process, like you said, You and I had a conversation a while ago. It wasn't even related to this. This is going back. I was getting your perspective on some things. We've had another conversation since then, and somewhere in there, a dialogue began about potentially doing this. You and Sharon had a couple hours together. The three of us had a couple hours together the other day, and here we are now. So the question is for you is, through this whole process, what have you learned about yourself? What have you learned about your perceptions through this process?
That all is not right in the world, even though I might look at the news, and I think I shared with you, just since COVID, so going back 6 months, I've cut my news viewing like way down, because it skews your I think your opinion and your viewpoint. But when this stuff comes up, so back to your point, how have I felt? It's just forced me to re-examine when I think, for example, that there's no racism in our area or in our region, that's just not the case. And as I said earlier, there's still work to do. But I have to throw in there, that's not just by law enforcement. That's by us as a community and as a region, as Christ followers. Right. We have to be in the middle of that conversation.
Right.
It has been eye-opening, though, in a good way, because I think I shared earlier, these discussions in this manner are way out of my comfort zone. In fact, people that know me are probably thinking, "What are you doing?" But I think it's important that we have to continue to press forward to improve these situations. We're not going to save the rest of the country.
Right.
I'm not trying to do that, but you know what? In our own little slice of the world here, for sure at Oak Hills, but in our city, in our community, to get people to have these conversations, I think it's important.
Yeah.
So
good.
I wouldn't have said that 4 months ago.
That's good, Jim.
Before you and I had coffee. So
that's good. Sharon, how about you? What have you learned about yourself, perceptions in this process?
I took great comfort in hearing from Jim and meeting with him for a few hours. And one of the things that was really important for me to remember is when he said, we come from respect, as a police officer, as a citizen. And that's what that's what I want. I don't want to be afraid of the cops. He doesn't want to have to walk up and, be fearful for his life either. I mean, at the end of the day, we want everybody to go home. I said this earlier, So I found in my time that it's not just hair trigger reactions, I take comfort in knowing that there are hundreds of hours that are being put into training and retraining. And I think when we met, I asked Jim, is this like an ongoing thing, or you pass that class and now you're moving on, and
right.
It's an ongoing thing, and that gives me comfort. And to some degree, we are very, very, very lucky here in Folsom, because we don't have the same kinds of situations that might be happening in Sacramento and certainly in other parts of the country. But I am excited that there's just an effort to keep learning.
Yeah.
And just to go back to what can be done to build trust. I don't know how budgets work, but I do know that, to see your regular patrol officer would be nice. Maybe they don't even patrol anymore. I don't know, but just more opportunities to maybe beyond coffee, because coffee just means adults get to talk to police officers. So it would be nice if there were other ways, that younger people could get to know police officers better, just to start to build that trust again. I think that's a major problem.
Yeah.
Even if it's not here in Folsom, we're watching news, and that makes us anxious.
Right.
And it doesn't bode well for other, even, the greatest of cops, when we're seeing things on the news from other places. I just really appreciated being able to speak and get a little bit more of just what goes on in the training
Good.
process.
That's good. So it's important, as we sort of wrap up here, it's important to know, I mentioned a little bit about this at the beginning, but just to kind of understand and get a vision, not just of what this was tonight and what we're trying to do here, but this fits in with the larger vision of who we want to be as a congregation and where we believe God is at work in our community and in our lives. And just to kind of set that up a little bit, we've done 3 of these. Sharon was in the first one, her and I. Sharon, Allison, and I were in the second one. And now here's this third one. After the second one, I think after both of them actually, but after the second one, Jim sent me a really well-written, well-thought-out email expressing some of his thoughts about what we had talked about, some of the points where he had difficulty and wanted to push back, but it was all done in a very redemptive, God-honoring, and communal way. And I took his email, went through it myself. We met for coffee, and we talked through many of the points that he had raised in the email. The reason I bring this up is, like I mentioned, these guys didn't know each other a couple weeks ago, and yet here we are having this conversation, and they've had other conversations that have they've challenged each other, they've grown together, they've learned to listen to each other, they went into the conversation seeking to learn from each other, and all of these things are something we talk about constantly here at Oak Hills. We talk about it as an outworking of what the communion table is all about, a place where we come and we remember, first and foremost, we're citizens of God's kingdom, we're Christ followers, and we're brothers and sisters in Christ. And these two, what I hope has happened tonight and through some of this story, is you've had a chance to see a really good example of 2 people who are brothers and sisters in Christ, some different perspectives, some different backgrounds, but they came together to talk this through in a civil, redemptive, God-honoring manner, not just here, but before here. And in so many ways, this illustrates the kind of Christ-honoring community that we're trying to have here as a church. And this is one way to do it in the midst of all the division, in the midst of the screaming and the yelling and the violence, some of the violence we see in burned down buildings, and quite frankly, some of the violence we see like we did the other night in that debate. This name calling, insulting, inability to talk and listen to each other. And as citizens of God's kingdom, I just want to continue to keep it in front of us, to be called to higher ground, called to love, called to listen, called to gentleness, so that we can demonstrate in this world a different way, a better way, the way of God's kingdom. So I appreciate both of you and putting this time in, the work that you've done, the graciousness with which you've navigated this. And it has been a tremendous encouragement to me just to be able to see this unfold, not just tonight, but previously, and go, this is the kind of thing, if this could happen more and more within our congregation, the glory of Jesus would shine in us even more. So I appreciate both of you putting the time and work into this. One of the constant questions that we are asking and want to continue to keep in front of everybody is, so what now? What's next? Where do we go from here? And so right off of that point I just mentioned, some of you may have listened to this tonight and you've heard Jim say something, or you've heard Sharon say something, or you've heard me say something, and you've thought, I need more help to understand that. I don't get that. Sharon said this the very first week. I talked to both Jim and Sharon before tonight about this. If there's something you want to talk to either of them about, if there's something that didn't sit right, or you want more clarity, or maybe even disagree with, this is a great example, a great way for you. A next step might be to send Ashley Hansen, one of our staff people an email and just simply say, hey, could you put me in contact with Jim or with Sharon? I'd like to have a follow-up conversation and talk more about what came up during this forum. Both of them are willing to do that, and it's an excellent next step for you if something is stirring in you based on what was said. Not too long before we began tonight, an email went out to those of you who had pre-registered with a link to it, to a video called Procedural Justice. And it's a video that we were gonna try to work in and talk about tonight, but it didn't happen. But I wanna encourage you to take a look at that video. Both Sharon and Jim have watched it, and both of them believe it is helpful in this conversation. And so it's not very long, but it would be well worth your time. So again, if we think of next steps, we think of what's a follow-up, that might be something that you can do with your family, is just take a look at that video and perhaps continue the conversation in your own home and with your own friends. Then the third way to kind of take another step with this is, we talk about this all the time, but we have a ministry. It's called our Cultural Learning Group. It's a group of people that is led by Sharon and some others. And what that group does over the course of 10 or 12 weeks is what you saw right here, basically. It's different people getting together to listen to each other, to hear each other's stories, to learn from each other, and to learn how to listen to someone who's different and learn to value them, learn to dignify them, learn to understand where they're coming from, and a little bit more about why that's their perspective. So it's called the Cultural Learning Group, or the CLG. And Sharon is about to get another group going. We have about 13 people already committed to it. If any of this, the things around race or around some of these issues of differences and how do we navigate that, if that resonates with you, if it's something you'd like to explore further, there are some orientation meetings that are coming up where you can learn more about the Cultural Learning Group. And my encouragement would be to email Ashley Hansen here at the church. If you go on our website, you'll find her email very easily under the staff tab. And just email Ashley and let her know you'd like more information about the Cultural Learning Group, and she will get that information to you. Well, again, thank you guys for the time tonight. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for tuning in and taking the time, and we appreciate it and look forward to next time. Thanks for joining us tonight.